Welcome to all of you who do know me, and those of you who don't. My name's Heidi and I'm the Family and Local History Librarian for Eastern Regional Libraries. Today we're going to be talking about ancestors that served, and you hopefully will have received a handout I emailed to you this morning, which has got all the web addresses of everything we'll be talking about today. So don't worry about writing down any web addresses because they're all on that handout. So many families have stories that have been handed down. Many of these stories have included one of your ancestors served in or with and was recognised for, or was wounded and sent home, or even killed during X-battle. He was a war hero. At other times, there were no stories. Many returned servicemen and women did not want to talk about what they saw or experienced during war, as it brought back too many bad memories. Excuse me. Many young men thought it'd be a lark to enlist with their mates, go and show the Turks or the Germans that they were better. They thought they could join up, sail off to Europe, kill the enemy, and come home a hero. As we all know, war is not a lark, and more often than not, men were seriously injured and killed. They spent months, if not years, doing whatever they could just to stay alive and tried to help their mates do the same thing. At times, they suffered horrendous living conditions with regular gas attacks and rampant diseases. And that was before they even engaged the enemy. In some cases, had incompetent commanding officers who allowed the men underneath them to be slaughtered. Many of these stories have been embellished over the years, some so outlandishly that they cannot possibly be true. So, what do we know about what actually happened and how do we find out? Our record of history shows that the wars have been fought since around about 3100 BC and probably earlier, involving the ancient Egyptians. Wars have been occurring ever since the Roman conquest, the Crusades, Napoleonic Wars, and into the 20th century where there were 2 world wars. There have been wars for thousands of years, and they do continue today in the Middle East, Pakistan, and Mexico. So how do we determine if it's just a battle, a war, or something else? A skirmish is less than 100 deaths. A battle is between 100 and 999 deaths. A war is 1,000 to 9,999 deaths, and a major war is 10,000 plus deaths, and usually made up of multiple battles. Major wars with over 10,000 deaths are the ones that we will be focusing on and just calling it war. And we're not talking about terrorism in any way. These are actual proper wars. Which war do you think your ancestor served? What year did that war occur? Was your ancestor actually the correct age to serve in that specific war? And yes, some did lie about their age to enlist, but allowing that leeway, did the war they were reported to having been in actually occur during their lifetime? It's quite hard to serve if you haven't been born or have already died. Is it realistic for your ancestor to have served in that war? Or was it just a skirmish or a battle? Or did somebody just make up a story to embellish that person's profile? So who did they serve for? A country or a cause? Which brand of the armed forces, the Army, the Navy, Air Force, or something else altogether? This may have been determined by which war. There were no Air Force or Navy involved in the Boer War, as it was fought on land, not near the coastline, and it was too early for aircraft. Whereas the Napoleonic Wars were fought on land and sea. Many of us have not traced our family trees back more than a few hundred years, so looking at records prior to the 1700s would in most cases be a waste of time. So knowing more about our family's ancestry is an advantage. Do you know which unit, battalion or regiment they served? Did the group actually exist at the time the story was set? Many units, battalions and regiments were created especially in wartime. Others were ongoing. Some have been disbanded or merged with others. Did they actually serve overseas? Many men did see action, but on home soil, for example, the British Army. Others, such as the Australian Citizens' Army, actually never left Australia nor were trained to bear arms. They did the farming to provide food for the country during wartime. And so many women were included in that Citizens' Army. So while they did serve, it was a different type of service. And as far as war stories go, not very glamorous. What items relating to that person during their war service do you or another member of your family now have? Letters sent home or from a mate of your ancestor or from the War Office. Usually deaths were notified by telegram, specifically World War I and World War II, but there would have been follow-up information as letters, including receipt of medals or where their personal effects were if the soldier had been killed. Postcards. Many men didn't have the resources or skills to write in the trenches. So when on leave, they would send a postcard home. Medals. Service, gallantry, achievement, or maybe just participation or victory medals. Most of these were received by those enlisted. Photos of men in uniform, groups of men on the front line, a photo taken while they were in their camps. My husband's family have a photo of his great-grandfather in front of the pyramids, and I've seen many other photos very similar. Service records, which are the original documents which usually included enlistment information, medical, troop movements, promotions, and of course, court-martials. Many men kept diaries of their time at war. Many of these are now held in either specialist libraries, but some are still kept with the families of the men who wrote them. They usually include information about the conditions, what's been happening, as well as the names of many of the men they served with and made friends with. Other documentations, including pension records, discharge papers, post-war medical, war graves, and other similar things, to list a few. Newspaper articles and notices. There were many, many articles in newspapers around the world every day during war times. Some were about troop movements, others listed casualties and deaths, but sometimes they included photos and good news stories, such as the soccer match that occurred on Christmas Day in 1914 in no man's land, between the trenches in France, between German and the Allies. Records. Before we go searching, there are a few golden rules to remember. Be aware that not all records still exist. Many have been lost or damaged over time. Fire, flood, bombing, mice, dust, and age are just a few of the reasons why they may still not exist or ever did. Bad record keeping is also a possibility. And not everything is online. Records can be found in a wide variety of locations, and not everything is online. Only about 15 to 20% of all records in existence have actually been digitised. We are in Australia, and many of us had family members who served as Australians in the war that Australia as a country participated in, from the Boer War onwards. But let's look at when Australia formed its first united force. As we know, Australia was settled state by state and was governed by a parliament in each state until 1901, when the country became unified under a centralised government in Canberra, more commonly known as Federation. But how were our forces organised prior to Federation? When Australia was settled in 1788, Britain sent a military force with each ship of convicts and also some of the early free settlers. These militia made up of men from the British Army who were the first armed forces in Australia. And yes, at times they did get a bit rowdy, i.e. the Rum Rebellion in 1808. But overall, they were there to keep the peace, protect the people, and make sure that everything ran smoothly as possible. As we settled different parts of this huge country, the states were formed. They began to form state governments, stepping away from British rule. And our military units were no different. Each state ran its own force. These forces were known as the state colonial forces. They were gradually united under the Federation into federal units between 1899 and 1903, which is the period during the Boer War, despite most of those units that are serving in the Boer War coming under the colonial groups, and thus forming the beginning of the Australian Army. So anyone who enlisted after the 26th of January 1901 was automatically considered Australian Army, Navy, or Air Force personnel. Where to look for records to determine by a number of factors. Which country or state did your ancestors serve? When? So what years did the war that they participated in actually span? Which war or battle did they participate in? And where in the world was that battle or war fought? What national records are there and how will they help? So this is where we refer back to your handout with all these web addresses so you don't need to write them down. The War Memorial in Canberra has nominal rolls for World War I, II, and some of the Boer War records, along with a vast collection of other memorabilia and records. The DVA, or Department of Veteran Affairs, has nominal rolls for some of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and they're currently putting together nominal rolls for the Gulf Wars in the early 1990s. The National Archives is your first stop for service records for World I and II. Many have not yet been digitised, but you can request them at a price. Once they have been digitised, they are then freely available on the website for all to use and download. Please note that many of the World War II records are still considered closed and therefore not available because the information in it is still considered for 100 years top secret. Records for people who served since 1953 are held by the Defence Archives through the Army, Navy and Air Force and can be requested on a case-by-case basis. Please note that current privacy laws do apply, so therefore you can request your own records, or if the person has died, next of kin may order them. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, men and women who died overseas on the battlefields or as a result of combat are recorded in this website. There are records, information, certificates, and in many cases, photos of the cemetery or the headstone. Here you can find out the location of the memorial of the fallen military person. But also be aware that in many cases, the grave or memorial wall will not actually have the mortal remains of that person, as the person's remains were buried on the battlefield or unable to be recovered for many reasons. So many of these war cemetery graves are memorials only, but still definitely worth a visit. State archives hold many records associated with the colonial forces, that the state, among a variety of other records. Every state and territory has its own archives, holding records that pertains to that state specifically. And they do include Northern Territory and the ACT, despite them not actually being states. And a list of all those addresses, web addresses, are on the handout. National and state libraries. The National Library in Canberra and the various state libraries also hold a vast amount of documentation, including war diaries. Many of their collections are not online and have not been digitised and probably never will be. So definitely worth a visit when we can. But be aware their collections are so large, much is housed off-site. So before you go, search the catalogue, order the item that you're interested in so that they are on site for you when you go to visit. Also be aware you cannot borrow anything from a state library. You can use it there, but not take it away. So don't forget to take a phone, tablet, camera, or similar, as well as your notebook and pen, as well as some money for photocopying. Again, the web addresses for each of those libraries is on the handout. Museums. Many of the museums around the country, both big and small, have war collections. Some are on permanent display, others come and go. There are also a number of specialised war museums. The two biggest ones are the War Memorial in Canberra and the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. But others include the Soldiers Memorial Institute Military Museum in Bendigo, National Vietnam Veterans Museum in New Haven, the RAAF Museum, the Army Museum, the Man from Snowy River Museum, Queenscliff Maritime Museum, Port Albert Maritime Museum, the Queensland Memorial Museum, Darwin Military Museum, the Maryborough Military and Colonial Museum, the National Military Vehicles Museum, Scottsdale RSL Military Museum, the CQ Military and Artefacts Museum, the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum, Fleet Air Arm Museum, the Australian Army Infantry Museum, Fighter World, Army Museum of WA, the Australian National Aviation Museum, the Australian Military Intelligence Museum, the Australian National Maritime Museum, the RAAC Memorial and Army Tank Museum, and the Flying Boats Museum, just to list a few. All those are listed on your handout also. Historical societies are also a great source of information. Many of them keep files on the young men and women in their communities that went to war. These may include a photo, newspaper articles, and local commentary. They also may have records about the person's life outside their war years, school records, and the like. These type of documents, while unhelpful to finding out more about the person's war years, allow you to discover more about the person as a whole. And this can be especially useful if they never actually came home from war. RSLs are also another fantastic source. They have museum-style collections and records. They do not advertise their collections or holdings, and you actually need to go in and talk to them. Many of them do displays, which are changed on a regular basis. Many have generic memorabilia or other things specific to local people who served. Honour boards and cenotaphs, while these do only list names of local people that served, may help you to find out where your ancestor grew up, lived, if you didn't already know. Don't forget about your public libraries, such as Eastern Regional Libraries. Many have both family history and local history collections. Some, such as here at Croydon, even have military history collections. They can offer microfiche, CD-ROMs, access to computers and online services such as Ancestry and Find My Past. And don't forget the books. We have lots. Many of them also have staff who can help you with your research. Online databases offer a variety of accesses. Many of the online subscription databases are fee-based products and can be quite expensive. Many libraries and family history organisations have paid subscriptions for their members' use. Here at Eastern Region, we have access to Ancestry and Find My Past here in the library, while things like Family Search is free, but you need to register, and that can be accessed from anywhere, including home. Others, such as Scotland's People, Forces War Records and Fold 3, you need to pay an individual subscription to use. Other sources. Trove is Australia's premier newspaper archives, run by the National Library in Canberra. It's free to access and covers the majority of Australian newspapers and government gazettes from first publications through to 1954. Many local newspapers are included, as well as the national and state papers. Full-page digital scans, as well as translations on Australian newspapers, and they are continually adding new pages. There's a number of other subscription companies which offer access to vast collections of digital newspapers, gazettes, and periodicals from other countries. These include the British Newspaper Archive, newspapers.com, etc. Be aware you need to pay for a subscription to access these. There's also an ever decreasing number of printed periodicals or magazines that focus on a vast range of including military history. Your library may have issues of these to borrow, or you can search for them on an online app such as Libby. Libby is freely available to our customers. Gazettes, depending on who published them, can be sources from state archives, state libraries, national libraries, as well as subscription companies such as Ancestry and Find My Past. Gazettes generally are government gazettes or police gazettes. And in case of military history, we're looking at the government ones. Genealogical societies. There are many family history organisations around the country, both state and local area. Most of them are run by volunteers and charge a membership or daily fees to access their facilities, resources, and collections. They are an incredible resource as they offer help from some very knowledgeable people, along with access to resources not online and not usually found in any other location. Many of the local area historical societies are very happy to accept donations of information and or money for the upgrade of their collections. So when you finish researching your ancestor, you may make a decision to donate a copy of your research with sources to the Historical Society for others to benefit from in the future. Thank you for joining me today for this talk on Ancestors Served. I hope you enjoyed it and are inspired to search for new information about your ancestors that served. You never know which source will open up a vast array of information about your ancestor. Please refer to the handout with all the web addresses, as you never know which one might be the one you need. And if you need more help, don't forget Charles Roville and myself are always available for a chat or to help you.